Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, we got cut off there. My phone was telling me I didn't have enough battery or storage capacity, so I had to go delete a couple things to have room to make this video just for you. So I'm sure you're thrilled. So anyway, we were talking about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and that's basically the end of governmentally sanctioned segregation in America. It is passed on a bipartisan basis. In fact, there were supporters and opponents inside of both parties, and some of the most significant opponents of the '64 Civil Rights Act were actually Southern Democrats. A lot of them were really some of the most virulent opponents of it. There were Republicans who voted for and against it. There were Democrats who voted for and against it. So, nonetheless, it has the effect politically, because there was a Democratic president's signature on it. It has the effect politically of kind of moving the African American voting bloc to the Democratic Party on a almost unanimous basis. I mean, 90% of the vote in most recent presidential elections, dating back to '64. Now, that's a process that began with the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt really increased the appeal of the Democratic Party to African Americans because they supported the New Deal. And so that was a process that had already begun. There's been a little bit of a myth that has really taken hold that, the reason, the South went Republican was entirely due to civil rights. And that's not true, because there was actually signs of movement toward the Republican Party in places like Virginia and North Carolina that went back to Eisenhower's day. There was... It was not like all of a sudden all the segregationists switched parties. That's a myth that people try to push on people. But the reason why, why the Democrats probably got so much credit for passing the '64 law was that in '64, when Johnson is running for re-election, or for his first election, because he was finishing Kennedy's term, his opponent was a ultra-conservative Republican by the name of Barry Goldwater, who was a senator from Arizona. And Barry Goldwater had voted against the '64 Act. Now, the assumption when you hear that is to assume that Barry Goldwater was this terrible racist and a huge fan of segregation. That's actually not the case. Goldwater had actually been a member of the NAACP at one point in time. He had worked to bring integration in areas of his state. But he was concerned there were some aspects of the '64 law that impinged on people's rights of freedom of association and a handful of other things. And so he was very libertarian in the way that he thought Goldwater was. At the time, he was considered like the champion of the conservative wing of the Republican Party. If he'd have been around in the modern era, he probably wouldn't be looked at the same way, because in his later years, he tended to favor legalized abortion and even favored the idea of homosexual marriage once that started to become an issue in the '90s. I mean, he'd been out of Congress, but he supported in some interviews, because he was very much of the government leave everything alone type of school of thought. But because those sorts of social issues were not really in the political domain until the mid '70s. He was really looked upon as being, as on the far right spectrum. So, and Goldwater, one thing that Goldwater was calling for was a far more aggressive stance towards the Soviet Union. He was more willing than a lot of people were to move beyond containment towards rollback, or the idea of, using force if need be, toward decommunization of parts of the world, and it was much less hesitant about the use of nuclear weapons than some of the peace activists would like. And so Johnson famously runs an ad known as the Daisy ad, which I'll try to remember to send you the link to, which was a campaign ad that shows this little girl out picking flowers in a meadow. And then all of a sudden you hear like a nuclear countdown in the back, like 5, 4, 3. And then it goes off and you see a flash and you realize that the poor girl who was picking the daisies is dead. And then and then Lyndon Johnson comes on and is like, this is what could happen if Barry Goldwater becomes president, which is just the most, hardcore campaign ad I think I've ever seen. Basically accused Goldwater will nuke your children. But anyway, Johnson winds up winning a decisive election in a landslide because he's able to kind of paint Goldwater as an extremist. And you'll notice that because of that, for years, a lot of the moderate wing of the Republican Party would fight really hard against, any kind of like diehard conservatives, with the logic of becoming the nominee, of the logic of it'll be another Goldwater, so you don't want another Goldwater, And so, the Ted Cruz of the world and people like that, that was always one thing. Well, we can't run another Goldwater. What's odd, though, is that Goldwater's campaign, actually, even though he lost, it winds up being one of the transformative moments that leads to the conservative ascendancy within the Republican Party. And he energizes conservative activists within the party to a great deal. Probably without the Barry Goldwater campaign and the network that emerged around it, it is questionable whether Ronald Reagan, who was then the governor of California, and who would eventually be elected president in 1980 after a couple tries for the nomination that didn't go anywhere, it's highly unlikely that he gets to the position he gets to without Goldwater having kind of laid the foundation, because Goldwater is the first real challenge to the New Deal status quo. Whereas, Roosevelt and Truman are full speed ahead on the New Deal, and then, Truman kind of expands on that apparatus. Eisenhower basically decides not to try to go dismantle it, but Johnson is full on for a great expansion of that, which we'll call the Great Society, and we'll talk about that in a second. Goldwater is kind of the first candidate to run since FDR was gone on, we're going to go back to the way things were like in the Roaring '20s. We're going to undo the social safety net and so on. So Johnson wins re-election, and then he proceeds on to the Great Society, which was his expansion of the welfare state, and is connected to his concept of launching a war on poverty. He believed that poverty was something that we could end in a generation with the right government programs, and so he introduces a number of things that are kind of common parts of the American experience over the last X amount of decades. One was Medicare, which was health insurance for the elderly from the government. One is Medicaid, which is health insurance for the poor from the government. It's been expanded to include more middle-class people under Obama. And then you add some also kind of a lot of the basic welfare programs. They had different names for some of them then, but like the food stamps, what's now called TANF, or temporary assistance to needy families. It had a different name back then. I can't remember what it was. And he also Section 8 housing, which is the creation of the projects. All of those were ideas connected to Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. Now his ideas make a huge impact on American society. And he's certainly one of the most important presidents of all time, whether you approve or disapprove of everything that he did. But ultimately, a lot of Johnson's war on poverty stuff wound up being counterproductive, because the way some of it was worded. So, like, for instance, it's been proven over and over again, there's 100 social scientists you can quote on this. It's been proven over and over again that no factor is a bigger deal in ensuring economic stability more than family stability. If you get a job, get married, have children, and stay married, that's the best recipe there is for making sure that you and your generations, eventually move out of poverty. One parent households, households where you have a single parent with kids, they're much, much more likely to be poor. Much more likely to be poor. And children who grow up in those kind of homes are much more likely to be poor. So that seems to be a more important statistic than almost anything, is family stability. Well, in the Great Society, the ways these programs were set up, you got more money if you didn't get remarried. So if you were a single mother, you stood to potentially lose money economically by marrying, which therefore ensured that your child was going to have a less stable home, which is going to ensure that he was much more likely to be poor when he's an adult and his children after him, right? So one of the problems of the modern welfare state is that it really created perverse incentives. That is, it incentivized some of the wrong behaviors, like having children out of wedlock. I remember talking to someone one time who was collecting unemployment, and I was suggesting this job and that job, and ultimately, he was like, well, if I do that, I'm losing money by taking the job, and to which I would have told him to do it anyway, because you're supposed to, support yourself, and not, take money from the taxpayer. But, nonetheless, it's going to be hard. It's a lot of times hard for people to make a decision like that, to give up more money being on unemployment by going back to work, right? So, some of the problems with the welfare state were fixed by some legislation that was passed in the 1990s that limited how long you could be on it and created certain work requirements for receiving it. But even with that, there were still some loopholes and stuff, and there's still obviously people that abuse the welfare system. But to be fair, even though I'm typically a critic of the welfare system, I do want to say that there obviously are families that are, in the short term, materially more well off for having, had some of their food paid for and so on. The question is, in the long term, can some of this assistance be counterproductive? In the old days, churches and private charities had a lot more impact on feeding the poor than the government did. And one of the things with that is they had more discretion if they felt like someone was abusing the system and, living in bad habits and so on. They had more leverage, whereas now, like, the government can't pass laws that where welfare commissioners just decide who seems like they're down on their luck and who seems like they're making bad decisions. It's not their job to decide, and you wouldn't want the government having to make those sorts of decisions. So that's one of some of the downsides that come with it. But nonetheless, whether you're pro or against the welfare state, whether you're in favor of the short-term benefit towards the people, and you think that trumps some of the long-term problems, or whether you think the long-term problems are more important, very, very important set of policy ideas that Johnson pushed. So, connected to during the time of Johnson, but also his successor Richard Nixon and even his predecessors Kennedy and Eisenhower, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was a man by the name of Earl Warren. He was actually an Eisenhower appointee. And the Warren Court, that is the Supreme Court as it was during the period where it was led by Earl Warren, in the 60s and 70s really asserts itself as a major, major force in American society. It did some things that were good, some things that were heinous in the case of Roe versus Wade. So one thing about the Warren Court, though, is that it's famous for really pushing the idea of judicial activism, which is the idea of kind of the court imposing what it wanted to be the law, whether it was the law or not. Now, there's a couple of these things that we're going to talk about I actually agree with the Warren Court on. Several of them I disagree with vociferously. But either way, the Warren Court established a precedent where it became more and more common for the judiciary to move beyond interpreting the law as it was written on the books and move into rewriting the law to kind of meet their preferences or what they thought was the right thing at the time. And that's going to lead to a number of major decisions being taken out of the hands of democracy. So, one of the things that the pro-life movement runs up against, trying to work against abortion, is the fact that the bottom line is, as of right now, there's Supreme Court precedent from Roe versus Wade in 1973 that says that, now this is insane, but the court found a way to make the claim that there's a constitutional right to abortion. Well, I'm pretty sure that would have been news to James Madison and George Washington and John Hancock. I'm pretty sure that would be news to them. But nonetheless, every state law trying to limit abortion runs into, that precedent set by Roe versus Wade. So judicial activism, it's a dangerous game. Thankfully, the conservative movement made a big enough deal out of judicial activism that you started to have a rise in the philosophy of originalism, which is the idea of trying to put laws back in their original meaning. But the thing is, there's a danger because the left have been playing judicial activists so long. There's now a danger for right-wing judges to do the same thing. And that's, a danger, and either one of those things is dangerous to democracy. You want the people to be able to vote on important issues, except where they actually contradict the real constitutional rights, not the made-up ones. So we'll look at some of the things that the Supreme Court handed down, and we'll kind of evaluate which of these were good and which of these were bad. The first one, which was a good thing, was Brown versus Board of Education, which we talked about in the previous video, that ended public school segregation, and that to me is pretty clear. It was obvious that those schools were certainly not equal. They were claiming to be separate but equal, but they most assuredly were not. So Brown versus Board, score one for the Warren Court there. Gideon versus Wainwright, 1963. The Supreme Court rules that the state has to provide an attorney to one who cannot afford it. Honestly, I'm just so used to that concept. I don't know in the context how much of a shock that would have come to people, because that does seem to be a pretty big step for the court to order. But on the other hand, it is true that if you are without an attorney, you are really up the creek. So, obviously, for the justice system to be functioning fairly, people need to have access to counsel. Miranda versus Arizona, 1966. You might be familiar with the Miranda rights if you've watched television ever, and, when someone gets arrested, they say, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you can say can and may be used against you in a court of law, that whole thing, that mandatory resuscitation of rights at arrest comes down from the Miranda versus Arizona case, where the Supreme Court ruled that the law enforcement had to present those rights to those who were being put under arrest. 1962, Engel versus Vitale banned state-sponsored prayer in public schools. Up until this time, even though there was no established denomination and there was no established Church of the United States, there was still just kind of an informal establishment of Protestantism. And it was just kind of taken for granted, that, you're in school, we're a Christian nation, we should have kids say prayers at the beginning of the school day. Well, 1962, in a crusade that was led by a militant atheist named Madalyn Murray O'Hair, they brought a lawsuit saying that this was infringing on her child's right of religious freedom because he was an atheist and was being exposed to prayers. And Engel versus Vitale actually shuts down state-led prayer in schools, and creates a precedent for much of the 70s, 80s, early 90s that limited the rights of voluntary prayer in school. Now, since the mid-90s, the tide started to turn in terms of case law. It's now pretty much very well established in court precedent now that individual students have the right to pray while they're at school. But that was very much in question throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that Engel versus Vitale is really one of the beginning moments of kind of the rise of the religious right movement, which we'll talk about more next week, which kind of increased the level of explicitly Christian participation in politics as social issues began to move to the forefront. and I think, I'm a little less upset about like the end of public school prayer than some Christians are, because I've known some public school teachers. I don't know if I want them leading my children in prayer, especially now that just it is the reality that you have so many teachers now that are, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheists, whatever, and forcing them to recite prayers. I don't like. But it's also the case that the logic of Engel versus Vitale represented a misunderstanding of the First Amendment, because what the First Amendment was intended to do was to prevent government domination of religion. It was not supposed to prevent religious influence on government. And so Engel versus Vitale is kind of symptomatic of a new way of thinking that people had, that government was supposed to be inherently secularistic, that religion had no role in things. And you'll hear people, when you try to do something as morally common sense as, banning the mass murder of children, will try to say, well, you can't, you're trying to impose your religion on the populace or whatever. And there's this idea that obviously, instilling an atheistic ethical system where it's okay to mass murder children is a non-religious idea, but the idea that you shouldn't is a religious one, and therefore shouldn't influence anybody's vote, and that's ridiculous. Because the reality is that Jesus is the King of the world. Go read Psalm 2. Be warned, kings of the earth, kiss the Son lest they be angry. So, the reality is, we need to respect the law of God as a nation. Not that you need to force people to be Christians, because that would be stupid, because they wouldn't actually be changed if they were doing it just because they were forced to. So, you don't want to, force faith on people per se, but you also don't want to create a situation where you're working against religion, and that's what Engel versus Vitale did to a great extent. And this leads to a series for decades of just stupid court cases of, someone suing the post office because they put up a nativity scene, and just all these sorts of, ridiculous things. And so if you want to wonder, you'll hear people, will write opinion pieces, why does the religious right feel like they're so threatened when, they're still such a big, percentage of the country and so on. It's like, well, Engel versus Vitale was one of the major steps of that. Everyone had just taken for granted that you would be able to open your school day in prayer for the rest of time. And then all of a sudden, the Supreme Court is telling people they can't. And that was followed up by, another famous case called Lemon versus Kurtzman that had another impact on, using government spaces for religious purposes and so on. Also, Roth versus the United States in 1957 really limited obscenity laws, which were laws that basically regulated like the content of, books, movies, etc. And it still was possible. Like, it didn't like straight up say that they had to like legalize like pornography and like obviously obscene things, but it raised the bar for obscenity laws in such a way that a lot of the stuff that you would see in a typical R-rated movie would not have been legal in 1955. They would have been prosecuted for obscenity, using certain profanities that are used on television all the time, would not have been legal in the 1950s. So, that particular case, the Roth case, enabled a lot more, a very different standard of content and conduct in the entertainment industry, which is another time where social conservatives are starting to say, wait a second, so we can't say prayers, but we can, put all this kind of filth on TV now. Okay, this doesn't seem like society's necessarily moving in the right direction. So, one thing that another area where the Supreme Court started to get involved in that was controversial was their involvement in kind of the one-man, one-vote decisions that made it such that state legislatures were not allowed to set up their states the way the federal government is set up, where states have a voice through, equality in the Senate and so on. The state is not allowed to draw districts in such a way that one district is larger than significantly larger than another. And that's, I think, a little questionable whether you want to enforce that, except that there's some civil rights stuff that was hanging over that wouldn't make sense to us as much now, but back then would have been a big deal probably. So anyway, I guess that's probably and we'll talk about the most explosive decision of the Warren Court is going to be the Roe versus Wade decision that legalizes abortion nationwide, but that's not going to hit until 1973. So we'll come back to that sometime early next week. So anyway, y'all have yourselves a good day, and hopefully I'll get to see you fairly soon.